Okay, cool. Started recording. Hello, and thank you for tuning into this episode. My name is Kathleen Tran, and I'm joined by our special guest, Jordan Cow, to speak on the Asian American experience. More specifically, we'll be exploring how the different environments we live in, like home, college, and postgrad, can impact us as Asian Americans as we navigate through possible identity crises. So, Jordan, thank you for offering your time today. To just give some context to the listeners as to how Jordan and I know each other, we actually met about a month and a half ago in March at the Vietnamese Interacting as One conference. He was the presenter for a workshop I attended called Made by Asian America and inspired this whole idea for a podcast about this topic. So, just to start off, Jordan, can you tell us a bit about your background? Where did you grow up, and what was the cultural environment like at home?
Yeah, Kathleen, thank you so much for inviting me onto this conversation today. Since meeting you about a month ago, I remember we had such a very productive conversation. I'm happy to carry that conversation over into today. My name is Jordan Cow. I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, but I currently live in Chicago, Illinois. I went to a local university within the area in Kansas, and I studied biology chemistry. Um, with the presumption that I grew up in Kansas, you might assume that my cultural environment may be a little more rigid than what most people would have expected, given that it is Kansas. But surprisingly, I grew up in one of the most diverse cities within the state itself. My metropolitan area of Wichita had about 650,000 people in the total population. And interestingly, if you call the Wichita Water Services line, you get you run into some settings and you say, hey, press one for English, press two for Spanish, and press three for Vietnamese. So there is a large Vietnamese population in Wichita, Kansas, and that's how I identify myself. Um, I am not very much of a religious person, but on top of being Vietnamese American, I grew up in a very Catholic community, a Vietnamese Catholic community. So parts of my identity are shaped by my Vietnamese culture, parts of it are shaped by my religious upbringing within this cultural secular space, and then also the other parts of it were crafted by me living within a very uh, white dominated community still within the state of Kansas.
Yeah, for sure. You touched on how Wichita, Kansas did have that Vietnamese community there. Growing up, how would you describe your connection to your Asian identity? And do you feel like that's changed over time as you've interacted and lived in different environments?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think when it comes to identity, I don't think that it's very static for really anyone, or at least for myself. And I think for a lot of people, it'd be okay if it ebbs and flows. More particular for me, growing up, I know that a lot of folks a lot of my peers or a lot of folks that grew up within the same community as me, they grew up speaking a different language. English was not their first language. And Kathleen, I'm not sure if you were ever enrolled in the equivalent of ESL when you were in primary school. ESL stands for English as a Second Language, which myself I was involved in up until middle school, because my born tongue was Vietnamese itself. I spoke Vietnamese up until first, second grade, and I had a lot of difficulty reading. So because of that, a big part of my identity during my early years was very Vietnamese. Um, Fortunate for me and very privileged of me, I am actually uh, second generation when it comes to education. My parents immigrated here during the 70s, but my dad actually went to college and pursued a higher education. So because of that, the household dynamic was a little bit different. My dad had to absorb himself and assimilate his own identity into a white corporate environment within within the company that he worked at. And because of that, he imparted some of those lessons upon my brother and myself. And because of his professional career, we were actually able to move our family into a more affluent area within the city. It was actually the most affluent zip code within the city itself. So the peers that I interacted with were not like me at all. Every Sunday, I would go to church at this Vietnamese church, and that is where I would see parts of my skin, parts of other people that looked exactly like me, parts of the culture that I grew up in my early years. But Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, I grew up in a very white community, a community that is very rich, a community that's very uh, one-dimensional. and a community that's very homogenous that understands only one thing, which is their white race, which is okay. But because of that, I my identity ebbed and flowed. Towards the middle chunk of my upbringing, I grew up in a white community. I wanted to fit in, understandably so, as most kids want to do. So I befit my character, befit my identity to match those that I surrounded myself with. Reflecting back on it now, parts of it were an instinct to survive, and parts of it was because I was still understanding who I was at the time. Um, and then after I graduated, and as I came into college and I entered into a more diverse space at a public university, my identity shifted again, subscribing more and deepening myself more within my own culture, not only my Vietnamese culture, but also my Asian culture. But on top of that, also my American culture is unlocking parts of my American culture that I had not unpacked before. So at that time during college, it's really a uh, melting pot and a juxtaposition of so many different identities coming together, racial identities, that is. And then as I've graduated and I've moved into my young adulthood and into my professional career, my identity more or less is more stagnant. I think it's because my brain has developed a little more. I'm a lot more confident in who I am. And then I'm also interacting with folks much like you, Kathleen, and entering into spaces like we were a month and a half ago that allow me to still learn much more about my identity even at the age of 26 today.
Mhm. No, during your workshop, you talked about how, like, being Asian American, like, some may identify or resonate more with their Asian heritage, and then some may feel that way with their American culture. And you talked about how Monday through Saturday, you were within that white community, but then Sunday you would go to church and you would see other people like you as a young child. So was it difficult when you were younger to kind of have to switch the different roles you had to play, especially when you were a child? Because I'm assuming maybe it's a little bit easier now that you're an adult, maybe having more of those experiences. Was it confusing as a child?
It was not something that I prioritized a lot. Obviously, as a fifth grader, it wasn't something that I cared about at all. My priorities were in other things in my life at the time. But as I grew up a little more, especially within high school, it was something that I really focused it demanded my attention. Because something I realized during high school was even though I grew up in a very white, affluent community, um, my high school had maybe 10 Asian kids throughout the entire 1,000 student population. And conveniently, I realized that six, myself and five others, happened to be in one friend group. So 60% of all the Asian kids within the school were just in particularly in one friend group. And I realized it was because there was an understanding amongst us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I was quote unquote Asian or I adopted this identity throughout the course of high school. I have an older brother. He is 4 years older than me, so just a generation above me. And as I was entering in high school, he was entering into college. And much like how when I entered into college, I took that time to absorb in the community around me, my brother did the same thing. So I was, as a freshman, navigating this whiteness within me, within this white community, while my brother was breaking apart some of those shackles and understanding who he was more with his identity. And there was some conflict actually, because my brother was participating within these Asian organizations on campus, whether student organizations or professional offices, he was getting really, really enriched from it and very involved with it. And word had trickled down back to my high school amongst my peers, my white peers, that my brother had essentially gone this different route. And I actually got a lot of flack for it. I got a lot of comments from my white friends about, oh, why is your brother doing this? Is what's going on? Why doesn't he hang out with his friends from high school anymore, etc. And that was something that I had to um, challenge myself, and I also had to challenge him on. I remember I got into a big argument with him about, yo, why are you behaving this way? Why can't you, quote unquote, just stay in the lane, like hang out with your friends, etc. Because I didn't understand what he was doing. I didn't understand his intentions behind it. So it was definitely something that as I grew older and I went into college, I had to really challenge myself to understand why he did what he did. And it wasn't until I got into college that I fully self-realized the position that my brother was in. So the idea between playing between these different masks, between Monday through Saturday, was very, very real. Um, Not only then, but also in the later parts of my life. So it was something that I did struggle with a bit. But then I feel like I had this very rooted whiteness or Americanness within my identity that didn't really want to believe anything else. Because I think part of it was the cultural factors, the cultural factors of the environment I grew up in, where I needed to look like a specific way to succeed. And what I mean by that is not necessarily I needed to look white, but I needed to act it as well. I needed to go to um, football games. I needed to wear vineyard vines. I needed to wear Sperry's. I had to dress in Nike socks or Nike Elite socks, or I had to get really involved in specific hobbies that just aren't who I am. And I remember coming into school on Monday. Um, Football games occur on the weekend, and I would go through the sportscast and look at the scores, even though I had no idea what was going on. And then I would come to school and I'd try to challenge some sort of conversation with amongst my friends or amongst my peers about it, even though it wasn't who I was. So there were attempts that I'd made to really mask that. But on the flip side, I'm talking so much about how I had to challenge my Asianness in this white community. On the flip side, I had to do the complete opposite at my local church because a lot of my friends at that church actually grew up in the same communities. They went to the same middle schools together, the same high schools together, while I grew up in a much different part of town. And because of that, there was this distance between myself and between them because they would have a different understanding as to their identity or a different understanding as to how they worked with amongst one another, which wasn't something I was particularly suited for at the time, just because we were diametrically opposed. Because if I spend Monday through Saturday amongst these white peers, it is more or less going to be who I am based off environmental factors. And then the one day I flip that switch off, it just really grinds to a halt and really grinds against the opposing views of my other friends within the church community. And parts of that also, growing up with this white community, was I had to really, I mentioned that I was a part of this program where I needed to improve my English skills over the course of my elementary, middle school, and high school, I lost a lot of that ability to understand Vietnamese and speak it very, very well. So there was also that cultural element at church on Sundays where I wouldn't be as well versed as my friends because they grew up in communities. They go to high schools where 30% of everyone there is Vietnamese American. So they are able to have conversations with one another, while I don't have those opportunities to advocate for myself as they do. So there was also that feeling of am I enough as an Asian American? Am I enough as a Vietnamese American? Or am I enough as a Vietnamese? Just because I myself am not able to speak to the same level as they are able to speak.
Right. I feel like because I also grew up going to, we didn't call it ESL, we called it ENL, English as a New Language. So I've realized after talking to so many people, it's called differently in a bunch of different regions, but I was in it until I was like 13. And I also just like started to lose my Vietnamese too. And like even now as an adult, it's now I'm trying to fight for that back. I'm trying to relearn the language and the formalities of it all again because I essentially just had to get rid of it in order to succeed in the school system that I was going into. Um, I kind of resonate with your older brother, but like on the opposite side, because I have an older sister, but she like didn't get involved in any of the like Asian organizations. Like she wanted to identify more with her American side, and that's something that she's comfortable with. And I remember like when I first started college and she had graduated by then, it was I kept thinking like, why didn't she like become interested or why didn't she at least try it? Um, Instead of like on your end of like, why are you getting involved? I was like, why aren't you getting involved? Um, so it's interesting how like the different perspectives kind of come into play, especially with like how it affects other people, especially in your family, and such. But I kind of wanted to ask, like I feel like as a child, sometimes these emotions of our Asian American identity, maybe they're a little less prevalent or underlying because like we're focused on school, we're hanging out with our friends, playing sports, trying to keep up with football, you know. So how could keeping those feelings under the surface lead to identity crisis at like a young age? Or just how can we begin to introduce those conversations of coming to terms with both of our identities?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot actually. I think this is a great question because I myself am not in an age where I want to have children anytime soon. But I have thought a lot that if I were to have kids of myself in the next 10, 15 years, how would I challenge them with these conversations? Is this something that I care to introduce at all? Are there different priorities that a kid should really be focusing on rather than trying to challenge their cultural identity? And I think that my parents did the best that they could. They tried to give us an opportunity with a mix of both, being able to um, exist within a very culturally Vietnamese community on the weekends, but then on other parts of it, grew up in a different type of environment where it was maybe more American or maybe homogenous or whatever word we use to describe it. I do think that part of my maturity down the road was because I was able to be exposed to these communities on the weekends very, very early on. I myself am not religious at all, but I know that if I were to have ch children in the future, that would want to expose them to something very similar. It may not necessarily have to be a religious-based organization, but I do think a lot of Vietnamese organizations out there are centered around some sort of cultural practice like that or some cultural belief like that. So I may sacrifice parts of myself to allow my children the opportunity to foster with an environment very similar to this. And why I think this is important is because as I transitioned in college, the only reason I was able to really enter into those spaces and those communities that were much more like me, very maybe Asian organizations or maybe Asian offices or diverse offices or professional offices, was because I had those connections with people at church on Sundays that drew me into those other spaces. Because for them, it was very easy for them to transition from those Asian student organizations in high school to the Asian student organizations back in college. And I would not have found myself in that position if it were not for the people that dragged me into it. And it made entering into that space and assimilating in the space a lot more easy because I already had those relationships. So I don't know if it's important to educate your 8-year-old on the different cultural identities and practices um, behind being Asian, but I do think that exposing them to these types of environments will lead to less confusion on the road or less difficulty down the road if they choose to invest their time into this. Um, so that is something I do think about a lot, and I am very appreciative of my parents to have exposed me to these communities early on in my life.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Going back to like how we like met in your workshop, I enjoyed how before we would go into a discussion, we would define the concept, like for example, racial identity. And I want to do the same with identity crisis, because for me, um, you know, I feel like when I experience an identity crisis, I feel confused and guilty, really lost, but still going through the motions of everyday life because I feel like in order to kind of get rid of it, I just have to go through the motions and eventually the feelings will go away. So for you, what does an identity crisis feel like, in general with your knowledge that you know of, or maybe from personal experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that when I first had, when I first entered into college and I was entering into these spaces where it was very diverse and accepting of different um, types of cultural identities, I knew what I was looking at, but I didn't understand it. I knew that I was in a space for Asian students within an organization. I was in a space for multicultural students within a community, but I didn't really understand what it meant at all. It wasn't until much later on, towards the tail end of my college or into the early parts of my adulthood, that I focused in on literature that centered around identity, either how you grew up as a children of immigrant, or how you grew up as an Asian American, or reading books specifically about Vietnamese literature, the implications that led to my parents immigrating here, such as the war, or some of the cultural differences or cultural difficulties coming to America as a Vietnamese American immigrant would challenge you, challenge my parents. Um, so it wasn't until the tail end of the last several years where I really understood what I needed to do to really gain more exposure to it. And I'm a big believer that up until the day that I die, I will always be a student of something. I will always choose the opportunity to learn more. And I feel like I'm always in a perpetual identity crisis. I will always feel like I need to be more. I will always feel like I need to prove myself to some degree, either to my parents or to myself, to you, to people within our space, our community, or to people on the streets. I feel like I can always understand a little more about my culture so that I could be an advocate for um, a younger version of myself if the conversation ever came to be. Um, so the idea behind this cultural crisis, this identity crisis, is something that I advocate for everyone to really challenge themselves on, whether it's through means of going through the motion and hoping that it subsides, or for myself really challenging it and like really leaning deep into it. I remember when I had just graduated college, I was very focused on reading those types of books. I There weren't these spaces that were available within my city as much for young Asian American adults. So I got together with a bunch of people and we helped organize an organization, a nonprofit within our city for it, or leaning outside of my local community and entering into spaces much like the one we were at a month and a half ago, where we are able to meet with other people on a more national level or from especially different parts of the country that have different backgrounds. So I will always encourage myself to learn more about my cultural identity. Granted, there are times in which I may be a little lazy with them, much like how I would not encourage an 8-year-old to spend their entire time on cultural identity. I do think that there is probably some healthy level of balance as well, where Kathleen, I would never encourage you to just focus your entire life to uncover your cultural identity. There are other parts that I would encourage you to lean on more as well. Maybe other parts within your social circle, or maybe your faith, or whatever, or your fa relationship with your family. But I am a very big advocate, and I'm honest in when I'm saying that I, even at this to this day, still feel like I could learn so much more. I still feel like I will never be able to learn enough, and I always want to be able to come to a position. I want to go to a position where I can advocate for myself 5 years ago, and then in 5 years from now, advocate for myself where I'm sitting now, and then in 10 years, do the same exact thing.
No, I love that you like challenge yourself to just take it on full speed. That's something that's very inspiring, especially since I'm in a stage right now where it's harder for me to find that courage and I just want to run away from it. So this is very inspiring for me to take on that challenge. You mentioned earlier how when you went to college, you started getting more involved with your like Asia student organizations and things like that. So can you just share like what you got involved with that helped you, um, get connected to your Asian identity?
Yeah. So I was able to enter into spaces that were very social based, no different than a Vietnamese Student Association, an Asian Student Union, those types of communities and those types of spaces. So I spent a lot of my time during college in those spaces. But then I also realized that as much as I can socially understand my identity, there are other parts of my identity that I also need to uncover, especially if I want to look long term. There were professional offices on campus that I was able to expose myself through. And it may not necessarily be centric around my identity as a Vietnamese American or an Asian American, but it does focus on diversity within a workplace. Diversity in what does it look like as a person of color or a um, coming from whatever specific background. I also leaned into those spaces as well. So I captured a lot of who I was socially within those social communities, and that's where a lot of my friends come from, and that's where I'm able to really absorb a good sense of who I am. But then the other spaces as well allowed me to apply my learnings into my professional career or into opportunities I need to seize up. If I were to enter into a very homogenous white space, how as a Asian American can I make space for myself? Or if I were to want to look into specific upcoming opportunities, how should I frame my narrative to showcase my identity, but then also showcase other parts of my professional experience that makes me very well-rounded?
No, that's great that you dove into all of that, especially taking advantage of those opportunities in college. Something that I remember from your workshop, it was the Spider-Man meme where they're all like pointing at each other. And for any of the listeners, the graphic seems humorous, which it is, but it was very fitting for what Jordan was talking about. As it was demonstrating how, as Asian Americans, especially when we begin to interact in new spaces, we start to assume multiple personalities in just trying to learn how we best fit within those communities. So, like, there's you at home, then there's you in school, and then there's you at work. And then there's also you within those social circles. But playing all of those different kind of roles can come with these subconscious burdens that prevent us from embracing our true selves. Like at home, we will carry generational trauma. In school or work, we assimilate and maybe we tap into the model minority a little bit. And then within our social circles, we're all just desperately trying to be seen and make connections out of fear of rejection. These are all just things that Jordan talked about in his workshop that stuck with me ever since then. I think for me personally, definitely felt, I feel the effects of an identity crisis and having to learn how to play all these different characters in the different spaces that I interact in, especially in college. Like sometimes when I'm in the around the Asian community, I feel a lot of pressure to have to like prove my Asianness, um, especially since I come from a predominantly white community at home. And then um, sometimes it's just strange because like it's still evidently clear that I'm very strongly tied to my American culture, and that's something that is important to me, and I don't want to completely get rid of just to prove my Asianness in that community. So, um, Jordan, what would you say? What would you recommend to listeners to balance all of these different roles that they're having to play, or should we even have to learn how to do that?
I'm going to answer that last question first. Should we even learn how to do that at all? And as much as I hate to say this, I do think that there is some level of um, artificial behavior when it comes to navigating a lot of different spaces. Um, and a part of me speaking this comes from my dad and comes from the idea within Asian American or as an Asian that you have to be very submissive, very quiet. You should not really disrupt anyone else. Um, and I'm trying to remember which study that I remember reading this from, but there was a study that pretty much indicated that of all the different demographics and racial minority groups within America, Asians are the least to be politically active. And part of that reason is just a cultural idea that your job is to make good for yourself and for your family and to not bother anyone else. And that is something that my dad instilled upon me. So my dad is an electrical engineer, and he worked at a very white corporate aerospace company. And one of the things that he kept encour advocating for us to do was to work twice as hard as everyone else, but to be twice as quiet as everyone else as well. Because you, as a person of color, need to do what you can to survive within the workspace. Um, And obviously, I think part of that comes from trauma that he instilled himself because he obviously grew up in a much different time where racial identities was a very hot topic issue as he entered into America. And that obviously developed his understanding of how race is in America. But then he also comes from a war-torn country where the idea of needing to survive is so pervasive within his day-to-day life, even though we live within the comforts of America. Um, so I've come to learn that I need to wear different hats depending on the environment that I'm in, just so I don't disrupt other people or to do the best that I can to survive. And I do think that there is some level of needing to do this. I would wish that I could advocate for everyone. Um, that you, Kathleen, or my best friend James, or other people that we interact with, that they should be authentically who they are. And I will never not encourage that. But I do think that there is some level of security and precaution that you need to take just because you, as a person of color within our country, where Asians may are seen as submissive and weak and fragile, we need to be very conscious of the way that we communicate our ideas as to not be taken advantage of or to not be ta trampled down on or to not be seen as incompetent or uninvolved or whatever else. So I do think that there is some level of calculation that you have to impart within the way that you uphold yourself. At home, I'm very true to myself. I talk to my mom as if she's my best friend. I joke with her. I annoy the heck out of her as much as I would with any of my friends. And that's just the relationship I have with my mom. But at the same time, there is a great deal of respect that I have to give to her that I don't afford for other people. I'm very, very conscious of the way that she is taking care of herself. I love her so much. But then also this translates to other parts of the family as well, either to Kathleen, I'm not very sure if you've ever had this experience, but when you enter into a space like your parents' friend's house, and you have to go up to every auntie and uncle, and you have to bow to them, and you have to
Yes.
greet them, even though you've never seen them before your entire life. And before you even do anything, that's the first thing that you have to do. That is something that I'm just ingrained on doing, or being very appreciative of the folks that invite me into the space. If I go to a restaurant, an Asian, particularly an Asian restaurant, even if they may not be Vietnamese American, I will bow to them just because that's just an understanding that my parents instilled upon me. Um, and so those are the cultural identities that I carry with myself. But obviously, I'm not going to employ some of those behaviors when I enter into a client meeting at work. I think that it'd be very confusing for them if I um, bowed hypothetically at the end of a meeting. I think it'd be very, very confusing. And I don't want to endanger my professional career by living authentically to some of those practices that I grew up in, even though that is truly who I am. And then other parts of my social circle or my social life. You described it earlier, Kathleen, where um, we wear different hats and the way that we are existing within our social circles. We just want to make friends with people. We just want to be seen. And the way that I interact with my friends obviously isn't true to how I grew up. I grew up at home. And I do subscribe a lot to my American identity as well. I know that this conversation is about our Asian identity, but I also am very big into leaning into my American identity. I am very grateful and privileged to be able to grow up within this very developed country in America where I have the freedoms and luxuries that are afforded to me because of the system that we live in. Um, so I reap those benefits as well. That's part of who I am. I do enjoy American food a lot. I do enjoy driving my car once in a while. I do enjoy quote unquote American hobbies such as watching sports or participating in um, going out to like eat with my friends or going out on late night with my friends, whatever else. Those are parts of my identity that I also very much identify with. But I do also just silo those different parts out depending on the circumstance or the environment that I'm in. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm inauthentic to any one of them, but it is a little artificial to representing myself in a specific way just to ensure my safety or my ability to be taken seriously or whatever else.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I actually the bowing thing you mentioned earlier, I used to do it a lot as a child because that was when my parents would always go to those different Asian parties and it like turned into a habit. So like when like strangers would like open the door for you or just like hold the door open because you were right there, I would, as a child, like young Kathleen would just like bow. And I remember it was just like a habit I had to like break out of because I was like, can like my other friends were like, why are you bowing? Like, or it's like we're in a soccer game. It's like we don't bow. We like shake hands at the end to say good job. Like we're not bowing. So that was definitely an interesting habit I had to break out of as a kid. It's funny that you brought that up. Um, we talked about like our identities at home and in college, so kind of transitioning into the post-grad life that you're living right now. You're out of college, you're in corporate America, like you said, in Chicago. So what was that cultural transition like when you had to sort of maybe readjust to another unfamiliar environment and community?
Yeah. So I think there's two ways that I could look at this. The city that I live in now or the workplace that I live in now. So let's talk about the community first. I grew up in Wichita, Kansas. I mentioned that it is fairly diverse, that I grew up in a community that is very largely Vietnamese American. There's a lot of people that I could identify with. A lot of there's no shortage of Vietnamese restaurants, and there's no shortage of running into Vietnamese people when you go grocery shopping or whatever else. And it's just a part of my life. But living in Chicago is a different beast. It is like I think 17 times bigger than the place I grew up in. So there is 17 times more Vietnamese Americans that obviously that I'm running into on the daily. Um, but growing living here now, race and identity is something that I'm very aware of, but at the same time, it's not something I'm very aware of because Kathleen, I'm not sure if you've experienced this, but if you're the only Asian in a room full of non-Asian people, you are able to quickly realize that.
Hmm.
But if you are one of many Asians or one of many people of color within a space, it's not you realize that, but it's not still something that you don't realize at all. Um, Race is becoming or wanting to find Asian spaces within this community here or diverse spaces within this community here is less of a challenge. It's more frequent, it's more ubiquitous. I run into it very, very frequently. Whether I run into Asian communities or Latin communities or Black communities or other communities, it is just so much more common here, and I'm very excited for it. Part of the reason why I decided to move to Chicago was just because of the diversity, not only in terms of demographics and population, but also opportunities of the types of conversations that people would have. But it was something that I definitely slowly uh, enveloped myself into as I moved here. Especially because when I was in college, most of my social circles there were Asian because I hung out with the same people, went to the same offices, went to the same organizations, took the same classes with these people. But now as an adult, I am not in those communities and I'm not in those spaces where after work, I'm gonna go down the street and hang out with my group of friends. And before we go to this general board meeting or whatever else, I have to be more intentional with the way that I'm choosing to take up space. So I encourage myself and I encourage others to actively seek them out. Find organizations that cater to your specific needs or desires. And if not, then find them, then create them yourself. I mentioned to you that back in Wichita after I graduated, there wasn't that space there. So I came together with several other leaders within the community and we created that space for other people. Um, in Chicago, those spaces are already existing, that infrastructure already exists. So I don't need to create those spaces for myself because I can just lean into them because they're just much more available. So that part is in terms of the social element of it. But the professional element of it is truly different. No one teaches you in college how to really handle a white collar career. And I work in consulting, so it is the highest definition of suit and tie at work. So I'm very, very familiar with the dry conversations, the talking about the weather, having very, very small, like dry, small talk about what you're going to do over the weekend, just as a means of trying to survive. But there's an added element of it because a lot of these conversations are based upon around what you're doing during the weekend or what your plans are for the next year or whatever else. And because a lot of my colleagues are very white, a lot of those conversations are very centric around their current lifestyle. And only once in and if I were to bring up conversations around things going on in my life, because I'm subscribing to those Asian communities here within the city, there may be some confusion. And I don't know if the 30 seconds before a meeting where you're making very small talk is the time to open up about uh, cultural understandings or cultural events or cultural importance in your life. And then also at the same time, I also have to understand that some people just frankly don't care about that. Not necessarily in the sense of it being malicious or rude, but some people, myself included, come to work just for the sake of working. And this small talk surrounding the weather or the game last night is just a means of filling up that empty space. So there are parts of it where I have to be very intentional and very, very forced with the way that I navigate my workplace, knowing that I know that my coworkers don't reject me as who I am, but I also know that they just don't care about it either. And that's just the parts of means of what I mentioned earlier with my dad, where you have to understand that when you enter in the workspace, you have to be 2 times as quiet, but 2 times as hardworking. So I'm very intentional with what I communicate, how I leverage my identity at work. Obviously, granted, I do work with some folks that are Asian or come from diverse backgrounds, and I'm able to relate with them very, very well. And those are actually my closest coworkers at work. But that is after I had come to the realization that the space that I had with them on a one-on-one setting was very safe or very, very intentional. So I was able to really open myself up a little more. And because of that, they were able to share those experiences with me as well. But I also ultimately think it's based off of the industry that you work in, what type of practice service line you work in. Grant, like I mentioned, I work in the definition of suit and tie white collar. Um, if you work in a more diverse or more creative space, then I think that it would be prudent for you to really explore spaces that allow you to um, take parts of your identity and incorporate it into your work and make you feel more understood, make you more seen. And I wish that for everyone. But there are just some places within corners of corporate America where they just don't care. Not because they don't care, but it's just not something that they care to introduce within a business meeting or the conf or contextually within whatever conversation is going on. So I understand the shortcomings of me advocating so much about my identity, but then also pulling so much away from it when it comes to my professional career.
Yeah, I think that's definitely valid. It just like differs between the industries that you work in. But also how like kind of like what your dad was saying, like working twice as harder but being twice as quiet, um, definitely makes a lot of sense. Um, I had a couple of questions here, but you kind of answered them in a lot of your responses earlier. So just to kind of like end the podcast and wrap things up, is there any advice that you would give to someone who is maybe currently struggling with their cultural and racial identity? And you also mentioned earlier that you have read like a lot of different books and things like that. So like feel free to mention any of those as well if you want to recommend them.
So I I think the thing that you have to really acknowledge if you want to like grow within your identity is whether it's important to you or not. I This entire conversation, Kathleen, you and I are able to share this intimate moment because it's something that we care about. But I also know that there are other people within my life, the same community I grew up in with this Vietnamese Catholic community, and they've grown up and they may reject their cultural identity. Not necessarily because they hate it, but it's just not important to them. And that's really okay. Whatever I would only encourage people to really lean into this if it's something that they really want to explore more of, if they really want to be intentional with it. I would wish that everyone had that same feeling that you and I share, but it may not be something that is just very broadly applied to the folks out there. Because it is a very exhausting conversation. It is very emotionally taxing, and it does require you to really challenge a lot of ourselves emotionally, socially, competently, all these things. And there's implications everywhere within your work, within your social life, within your family at home. And some of these things may just be too taxing for people to really want to invest themselves into, and that's okay. As long as they are in a place where they are very comfortable with themselves, I'm very happy for that. But for myself and for you and for anyone else that may be listening to this, I just really encourage people to really lean into finding social spaces, first and foremost, to be able to identify with other people. It may not necessarily even have to be people within the same nationality as you and I are both Vietnamese, but it may be Asians, Asian Americans, or maybe just communities of that are diverse and people of color, so that you can have a shared collective melting pot of different conversations and different backgrounds. Just so you can learn more. Maybe not you don't care about your Vietnamese Americanness, but maybe you just want to care more, learn more about the fact that you're a person of color. I encourage you to do so. But more specifically for me, as I look forward to the rest of my life and I look back on the parent learnings from my parents, and the relationship I have with my mom and my brother and my closest friends, I do want to impart parts of Vietnamese American into my future family, and the way in the future of how I behave, the way that I grow up, how I intentionally seek spaces for myself. And I do think that aligning yourselves with these social groups will open up opportunities outside. You may find opportunities to seek professional groups, or you may find a mentor in that group that grows you elsewhere, or whatever else. So that's, I think, the biggest way to go about it. It's also the easiest way to just find a group of friends because obviously we all probably already exist within groups where there may be other people much like us living in it. Um, I mentioned books. I am a big advocate of just reading any book. Ocean Vuong is actually one of my favorite Vietnamese American authors, so I would encourage people to explore some of their writing. But it doesn't have to be specifically Vietnamese Americans. I read books about Chinese Americans, about Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, just because I wanted to very diversify not only my experience as a Vietnamese American, but also as an Asian American.
Yeah, no, I just saw Ocean. I think they put out like a new book
Yeah,
recently.
they
So
did.
that'll be very exciting. But thank you so much again for your time to speak in this podcast episode. And for all of the listeners, I hope you're able to take this conversation to reflect on your own identity, learn how you want to embrace those identities, and just simply reevaluate how the different environments you interact in can impact you in the long run. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Kathleen.